and should be recording and streaming. So this is going to go out to a YouTube link as well. It'll be archived there as well. I don't think it actually makes any practical difference, but it's been done. So we should get recordings. And I'm just going to start a backup recorder here. Okie dokie. All right, backup recorder running. Is that actually getting any audio? Does not look like that's getting any audio. Is that not getting any audio? Excuse the technical equipment faffing. People keep dropping on. Come on, phone, work. Good. Okay. So as soon as I get the secondary recorder running in a way that I actually believe in, we will start. Come on, computer, work. Not liking the look of that. This the hard way. No, it is recording. Okay, that's fine. Yeah, there we go. Okay, I think that's about as much procrastination as I can do here. All right, let's begin. Recording is going, live streaming is going. Good evening. Welcome to the second of the meditation classes. This is the second class. So my plan is to do 3 classes, which are very heavily about the practice, just Q&A about what you actually do and how it's working for you. And then after that, I think we'll go into specialized topics, basically as people have gotten a bit more experience in basic technique. So let's see. I'm just checking who's in the room here. Okay, great. Okay, so Q&A format. Let's take some questions and just kind of roll from there. Just if you've got a question, unmute yourself. Go for it. Deafening silence. It's one thing we're used to, it's silence.
Everyone.
I guess, yeah, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, clearly everyone is sufficiently educated and enlightened.
What could be better than that? Oh, we still got people coming in here.
Yeah, I was. This sort of question has been asked before, I think, but sort of to me, the 3 phases sort of feels like sweeping out your space, doing the mantra, focusing on something, making a little space in your mind for yourself, and then kind of inviting yourself back into that space, and then focusing on an emotional part of whatever might have come in. Does that seem about right?
Yeah, I mean, the exact dynamics will vary a lot from one person to another, right? You know, for some people it will all seem very continuous. For other people it feel like you're kind of sharpening tools in one part and using them in another. The way that we interpret what's happening is very personal, even if what's actually happening is fairly the same for everybody. You know, there's a strong tendency for you to just kind of name things the way that they work for you, and to you that's objective and that's how it is.
And for the last part, for the emotional clearing part, you had talked about maybe focusing on that a little bit, and I would really appreciate that. That one's the most difficult for me for sure, to feel like I'm accomplishing anything.
Yeah, this seems to be a real common problem. So maybe it's worth talking about how we got here, and that will explain why that stuff is not so clear to people. So I did metric shit tons of mantra meditation when I was getting started, like really a lot of mantra meditation, and so the mantra practice was very well developed. Um, then I started into therapy, and the approach that I was taking is called client-centered psychotherapy, person-centered psychotherapy, Rogerian therapy, basically all in the school of Carl Rogers. And their approach is almost entirely about skilled listening. So you sit down with the therapist, you attempt to explain what's going on for you, and the therapist attempts to understand what it is you have said. They tend not to have a theory of mind. So it's not like a Freudian approach where, oh, your id is talking to your superego about your, whatever it happens to be. They're not expanding the story in that kind of way. They're not comparing your experiences to some kind of map that they're fitting you to. Their objective is to focus on the communication to ensure that they've completely understood what it is that you had to say. So most of my kind of experiences of learning how to be with my emotions came in the context of taking meditative experience into therapy. Oh, what's that? We got people who can't get in? Sorry, excuse the administration. Oh, that's annoying. Okay, that's a shame. Okay, so that approach of, you basically, take the meditative awareness into a therapy context means that I was in a position where I had somebody helping me understand my emotions as I was learning to figure out how my emotions worked. So I had quite a bit of assistance in that phase. And then by the time I came to structure this machinery in the way that it's actually done, what I had done was I'd started with the mantra meditation, then moved into the emotional stuff. And then once my internal dialogue stopped around 94, that was when the full weight of the open awareness stuff really landed on me. Like, oh, because I had pretty much continuous mental chatter. Even when I meditated, I would be attached to the mantra, but I wouldn't get internal silence in any kind of systematic way. Very, very unusual little flashes here and there, maybe. That was about it. Right up until I got dropped into silence, period, and the mind never really reformed. So in that kind of context, the emotional clearing stuff I never learned as a meditation, right? It was a thing that happened in meditation, but I mainly learned it through therapy. And I think it's very clear that the instructions that we've got written down about how to do that stuff are pretty specifically not helpful, right? Like, I would say, we've had maybe one or two queries about mantra stuff. The open sitting stuff, people seem to be able to just pretty much get on with. It's hard to get that one wrong in theory. In practice, it's a little more tricky, but in theory, people are not having problems with it. But everybody's getting their, just confusion around the sitting practice. So probably the best thing for me to do is kind of talk through that a little bit. Does anybody else have any specific points that you want to ask about that? Type them in the chat. I'll keep one eye on that so that we can cover it if there are specific details. Yeah, trigonal traumas being within their time. Okay. So let's. What is Max Callahan presenting? Is that something we need to? No. Okay. So let's talk about how this works a little. Hang on, I'm just going to adjust my chair here. All right. So. So, first step, establish seat, right? This is what you would do through the mantra meditation, through the open awareness meditation.
Specifically, eyes open?
I will tend to do open awareness, eyes open almost always. Mantra, I will tend to do eyes closed.
And emotional?
Emotional depends. But as far as possible, do everything both ways, right? Sometimes do your mantras eyes open, sometimes do open awareness eyes closed, because you're looking for completeness. You're looking to see all angles of all things. So don't get stuck on this is exactly how we do it. A little bit of experimentation, a little bit of fine tuning, a little bit of, figuring out what's working for you on that particular day. Don't allow yourself to get into a position where instead of meditating, you're thinking about how to meditate. So, if you're constantly thinking about, oh, maybe I should change my mantra, like you're doing it wrong, just pick one and stick to it. If you are like, when I'm doing the mantra with my eyes closed, I sometimes find myself what's happening in the room around me, and it's distracting me. Maybe I'll meditate with my eyes open. Okay, you could do, try little experiments like that. So, other things, awareness of emotion, typically easier if you go into the body first. So if you can feel the emotions in the body, patterns of physical tension and this kind of stuff, then it often makes it much easier to find complex emotional material. So we find something. Yeah, okay, there we go. Right. So kind of hunchedness and a heaviness, heart, chest, shoulders, sense of like burned outness or exhaustion. This kind of thing. Right. So that is a tough emotion, right? Particularly if you're middle aged. Anything that smacks of like, oh my god, why haven't you been able to get more done? Oh, that lands heavily because it's associated with your own mortality. Like, I just don't have, sort of 8 16-hour days in a row inside of me anymore. If I try and do that by day 3, my productivity is half what it was the day before. So, beginning to hit the limits of the ability to push on things. Okay, I was kind of, like I was just more capable when I was younger in terms of just brute force. I also spent a lot of time working on the wrong things for the wrong reasons, but, these are the trade-offs. But anything that smacks of like limits caused by age, those are deep emotions for people that are aging. 48, not old, but certainly not young. So there's a bunch of heaviness and a sense of like, okay, why doesn't stuff work? Keep doing the good work, keep putting the right options out in front of people, keep not being able to get people to actually use it. This is largely business stuff. We struggle like hell to keep the company going. We get to product launch, and then this fucking pandemic. The timing, right? So there's kind of a sense there of a deep frustration. Like, God fucking damn it. Why does it always have to be so difficult? Why is nothing ever easy? Why haven't I just won? Right? Tinged with emotions about aging, emotions about decay of capability. Like, I'm not really ready to be just smart for a living, right? What happened to powerful and passionate and strong? So all those emotions, what I'm doing is I'm feeling the emotion in my body, and then I'm letting information about the emotion flow into my mind.
So there is an aspect of analysis to this, right? Because to me, it tends to become more just like feeling without verbalizing or without analyzing, and seems to be very intense for me. And this was a big question that I had, whether an analysis is important.
So, I mean, the bottom line is that analysis is not important, right? And let me explain why. So there's just some lump of stuck energy. I'm giving you guys a notion of what that stuck energy is because I have a reasonable awareness of what it is. But simply knowing what it is does not move the energy, right? It's like, oh, now I know what I'm upset about. Okay, great. But then what happens? Now you just stay upset, right? It's not going to help. So what do? And that's the part where you just sit with the damn thing. Now, if I didn't have very strong awareness of my emotions in these senses, what would happen is that I would sit feeling the emotion, part of my brain would be monitoring, trying to figure out what the emotion is. Because those things are very integrated, rather than sitting with the horrible emotion and not knowing why I'm feeling this horrible way, instead I am sitting with the horrible emotion and my mind is also kind of processing the rational foundations of the emotion. That's happening in parallel for me because I've done a lot of this. Normally, you would tend to sit with the horrible emotion, then at some point there'd be a breakthrough where you were finally willing to face what the horrible emotion is. Let me try and model that a little. So you sit with the horrible emotion. All right, life is hard. And there's a whole bunch of stuff in there about people being unreliable, flaky, not getting their shit together, etc. Then as you sit with it, slowly the emotions drain. There we go. Right. And there's a lot of stuff in there about autonomy. Right. A lot of times I find myself in a position where I'm working very closely with people for reasons that are as much spiritual as they are practical. You know, you kind of have this feeling of these teams sort of magically or mysteriously formed to solve problems together. Like, oh, you've got one part of the puzzle, I've got another part of the puzzle, he's got a third part of the puzzle. If we all work together, we could change the world. That kind of, teams form to do things, and then those teams break to pieces because people just haven't done the work and can't keep their shit together. So there's a lot of sense of frustration about, like, I am never doing it that way again. Jesus fucking Christ. So all of those bundles of emotion, all those interconnected things, the parts of that you don't want to think about are what pile up inside of the body, right? So frustration with situations that I am unable to do very much about because the trouble is in the past and the problems are in the future. Like, oh, I knew better. Nobody would listen to me. Here we are. We're in this problem. Right? So those frustrations build up, and by feeling them, what happens is that the emotions gradually get processed, because what's happening is you're slowly turning feeling into change. Like, oh, doing this behavior in this way causes me to get this negative feedback in that these emotions are unpleasant. Therefore, I am going to change what I do so that I don't experience those unpleasant emotions in future. Like, okay, so what's going to happen is I'm going to change my mind about how I approach collaboration because the current approach, or at least the previous approach, has not worked for me. Okay, right, that is a learning step. I'm learning something. So the whole sort of notion that this stuff is about accelerating learning, the emotions are piling up inside of the body because they are data waiting to be processed. You sit there and you feel the emotions really deeply. You process the data, right? Okay, doing this way sucks. I'm feeling the result of that sucking. I will not do things that way in future. Change occurs. Once your system recognizes that you have decided to change or you're not going to do it that way anymore, generally speaking, those emotions don't come up again. Partly because your system recognizes that you've learned the lesson and you're not going to keep poking yourself about it because you've adapted. And secondly, because in the real world, you don't put yourself in the position where that stuff comes up again. Does that make sense? It's kind of two things, right? Number one, you're no longer kicking your own ass. And number two, nobody else is kicking your ass.
I'm having trouble with this a little bit, Vinay. Can I talk for 2 minutes?
Let me run through one more sort of way of looking at this. Alex, why don't you type some notes on what it is you want to talk about in the chat, and then that will help focus your mind in terms of exactly what it is you want to know.
Okay.
So the third thing about this is this, and this one is tricky. A lot of the stuff that gets stuck in the body is trauma, and trauma is a whole other kettle of fish. So emotions in the present, right? Something happens, you feel a particular way about it, it doesn't immediately clear, you sit down and you make time for feeling that thing. Why isn't my life easier? Right? So you feel that emotion, it's kind of in the present, you can learn what it is that you have to learn from it, move on to the next thing. One way it could go. The other way is a little bit trickier, which is what you could hit is trauma. Now, obviously, trauma is one of the great foundational planks of our civilization, right? We live in a culture that produces trauma in enormous quantities, and it's just a rough place. So then there is this question of, okay, what happens when you hit trauma? So trauma, something very old, right? Let's see if I can find something to snag onto. So you have a traumatic event, a traumatic memory, and the thing that makes trauma for most people, right? Two kinds of trauma: childhood trauma, adult trauma. Childhood trauma, the being experiencing the trauma does not fully understand what is happening because at the end of the day, they're a kid. So the conclusions that a kid draws about, let's say, bicycles gradually change over time because the kid rides a bike and learns more about bikes and has experiences with bikes, and gradually things change. If the kid falls off the bike, breaks an arm, and then doesn't go anywhere near a bicycle for 3 or 4 years, then comes back to try and ride a bicycle again, you have two things. Firstly, all of the information about bikes is 4 years out of date, right? Because there are a bunch of developmental phases which have been missed because of the trauma. And then, so when you start dealing with the bicycle again after the trauma, you have a developmental delay because you're years behind where everybody else is in terms of dealing with this. Part one. Part two is a little trickier, which is the kind of stuck emotions, right? You get close to the bicycle, you have broken your arm when you fell off it, lots of emotions come up. Was it my fault? What if it happens again? Will I get yelled at if I do it again because it was so inconvenient the last time? All of those emotions kind of come up, but they generally speaking come up as if they were being processed by being of the age that you were when the trauma occurred. So if you have the bike accident at 4 and you try and get back on the bike at 9, a lot of the emotions which will come up will be in the emotional palette and with the understanding of a 4-year-old baked into them. And that mess and confusion caused by having younger age feelings at a more advanced age is an enormous part of the trauma experience, right? And we've probably all met somebody in our life that seems like they're just a kid at some level. Little old ladies that seem to have an enormous joy in life as if they were 5 or 6 years old, but also create unbridled administrative chaos around them because they're incapable of following rules. Like, sort of look at that like, so how old were you when your father died? Oh, you was in a car accident when you were 6. Right. Wow, that's really awful. And then you think, okay, well, here's the connection. Something is frozen in time at that age and then never really matures out of it. So a big part of dealing with trauma is digging backwards in time to find the places where you've got this kind of stuck material and then what happens is that you're gradually updating your world model to fit the present truth rather than the past traumatic truth. So it's like, okay, so if we go back and you feel the old emotions, gradually begin to process it. Like, okay, bicycle, fell off a bicycle, broke arm, strong emotions about bicycles, strong emotions about transport, you know, doesn't, don't like to do this. And slowly what happens is that your mind, because it's got the time and the space to rest and process and metabolize, the mind slowly integrates the traumatic experience as if it was non-traumatic. So rather than having a bunch of material stuck in the pipe and a bunch of freaking out around the material stuck in the pipe is gradually cleared a little piece at a time, a little piece at a time, a little piece at a time, and gradually the traumatic mindset material smooths out and then clears through the kind of practical, daily, ordinary mind. And that process is slow and pretty difficult, right? Depending on how bad the trauma is and how severe what happened is, it takes a bunch of time to work through that kind of matter. Some people it's faster for, some people it's slower for, but it's a kind of slow pushing through the material until gradually things integrate. And that is really the primary purpose of the emotional release work. Like, as you meditate, the mind will tend to process your past, and it will clear all the backlog of things that were waiting to be processed. For most people, at some point, that means that you're sitting there meditating and a whole bunch of your traumatic shit comes up. You quite often hear about people that go on Vipassana retreats and then wind up with, like mental breakdowns immediately afterwards and this kind of stuff. I don't think it happens very often. The press makes a lot of noise about it when it does. But any kind of advanced meditation practice comes with the warning of, this stuff will really mess you up if it goes wrong. Be really careful with that. And 90% of those problems, 80%, 70%, but a vast majority of them are caused by people having fundamental trauma issues, which then come up during the meditation and kick them in the head. So I think it's just worth noting, like, that is a big driver of trouble in meditation. And this is why the cutting machinery approach spends so much time on the emotional clearing, emotional stabilization work, because for most people, that's where the problems will be. And what I'm hearing from quite a lot of people is like, I had a really nice childhood. Everything was basically fine. I get on really well with both of my parents. I sit here looking for negative emotions and I don't really find any. And, I kind of heard that with incredulity the first few times. Like, really? That's impossible. What do you mean you're a normal person? There are no normal people that there are just no normal people. How does this work? But I've come to the conclusion, now having talked to a number of these people, that there are actually people who just don't really have enough trauma to have any kind of substantial traumatic backlog. They worked it all out over the, kind of a decade or so after they were adult. And by the time they're in their 30s or 40s, life is fine and they just keep rolling forward. So, if you're one of those people, you're lucky. Right, let's see where Alex was at. Alex, do you want to pop on voice and tell me what this is?
Yeah, so I was very curious about what you said about learning that comes up, about kind of change of behavior that arises from emotional processing, which to me, what I wrote is it's mostly about increasing the amount of choice by virtue of being less afraid of emotions that usually prevent you from having choice, but not so much like, oh, this caused me a bad emotion, I'm not going to do it again.
Right.
In fact, it caused me a bad emotion. That emotion is actually not fatal, so I might actually consider doing it again if I have to.
Yeah. So, I mean, this is the actual part of the learning, is that things which make you feel bad don't kill you, right? So, again, a lot of us have had relatively sheltered lives. So when something bad happens that makes you feel awful, as you say, right, it does sometimes feel like the end of the world. Oh, this is a really terrible thing. Oh, it feels like I'm dying. I'm never doing that again. And then what you learn is that these things are actually not fatal, and it does make you feel bad, but feeling bad isn't the end of the world. I would say that stuff is, that kind of realization is accurate, but it should be regarded as a dangerous side effect. I'm guessing most of us have seen films like Fight Club, where you have these, deconditioned, wizards who feel free to do whatever the hell they like in the world because, after all, nothing is real and everything is permitted. Right? So you want to be very careful of that sort of feeling of invincibility. Like, oh, I've realized that emotional pain is just pain, and I can feel emotional pain, and it doesn't have to affect what I do. Wow. Okay, that means no limits, right? And, actually kind of sort of emotional pain is like physical pain in that it's often there to warn you about the potential for emotional injury. Like, okay, this really hurts. I'm not going to let that happen again. Okay, this really hurts, and then suddenly something goes dead. Like, oh, I've just realized that I've sort of fallen out of love with the world. I don't really care about anything anymore. Wow, that's emotional damage, right? That's gone from emotional pain to emotional injury. So that sort of process where you realize, like, the world is not just emotional pain, emotional injury is a real thing. That begins to get into the question of, emotional healing and repairing the astral body, tears in the aura, all the rest of that sort of stuff. So I would not be in a hurry to just be like, okay, pain isn't real and I can do what I want. Although that is true to a degree, you have to also remember the risk of injury, and pain is often a good warning sign that injury is possible. So I'd be delicate with that.
Gotcha. Well, it's interesting. It kind of happens very naturally in terms of like once you permit yourself to feel, you just feel.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, learning that you're not made of glass is really important, right? I mean, like, oh, I could fall and I don't break. Okay, that sucks, but I'm utterly okay. So learning that you're not made of glass, yeah, that's a really important thing. But you don't want to get into a position where you feel invincible just because pain is no longer a showstopper, right? It's a balance.
Yeah, gotcha. So it's a warning. Gotcha. So it's a warning in terms of like not taking that too far.
It's nice not to be afraid of your own shadow. It's kind of like people that work out a lot, right? Or you do martial arts a bunch. What you learn from martial arts is you're not made of glass. Like, oh, I can get punched and it's not a big deal, right? Just don't hit me in the nose. Nose is off limits. Anywhere else, it'll be fine. So that sort of notion of like learning that you can absorb some damage and it's okay. Over the early part of my martial arts career, when I was doing a bunch of harder stuff like karate and judo, bruises were not considered to be an issue. Like, oh, it is a bruise. Oh, well, so what, right? And that, gradually gives you a sense of kind of physical toughness. Great, that's useful. So emotional toughness, and I don't mean kind of hardening, but sort of familiarity with emotional difficulty, I think is quite useful. Like, much as I have a dislike of things like nonviolent communication and a lot of the facilitation practices, the people that are doing that stuff well are often very good at dealing with emotional discomfort. We're going to talk about something that is super important for us to talk about, and it's going to suck for both of us. But if we don't talk about this difficult thing, which is going to suck for both of us, the consequences for you will be much, much worse than they will be if we have the difficult conversation. So this is the kind of stuff that comes up when people are in management. And I mean, I've never been in the kind of management that involved me doing things like, performance reviews and firing junior members of staff. Like, I've never been that kind of manager. Because I've generally worked in very small teams. But for the people that are managing large teams of young people, 10 or 20% of whom are so flaky that you're going to have to fire them, I don't know what the actual numbers are from industry. I'm sure there are professions where you have to fire quite a lot of people just because they're young and they're dumb, and a lot of them make unforgivable decisions. So in those kind of environments, the skill of negotiating with the emotional pain of firing somebody is a critical part of your job. This hurts both of us. It really hurts you. It really hurts me. And if we don't do it, rather than you taking a warning now and changing your ways, you're going to get fired. Right? People are trained to do that kind of stuff in the same way that, if you do martial arts or heavy weight training or whatever it is, you're trained to deal with occasional minor injuries, and your body just kind of changes metabolism to be able to absorb those kind of things and heal them faster. And you change your notion of like, is this a dangerous situation to be in or not? No. If I fall, I will not break. Okay. Right. Same thing with the emotional side. So it's not that you can't develop skills that are rooted in this kind of stuff. There are a lot of people that do, HR people, for example, therapists to some degree, doctors, these are all people where that kind of emotional resilience is a really important thing. But we just have to remember that it's kind of, it's just a thing that happens, right? You don't want to lean into it as if you're invulnerable. There are certainly, stories about that kind of thinking inside of the traditional practices. Very little of that stuff applies here and now. Okay, emotions from George. Do you want to say something, Yorgos?
Yeah, just what it was in the chat, really.
I always have a super hard time remembering how to pronounce your name. I always feel like it doesn't matter how I say it. I always feel like I'm getting it wrong. One more time.
You got it right, buddy. Don't worry.
I still don't know which way. Anyway, go on.
So if you get an emotion and it's not clearly associated with a single memory. So the example with a bicycle, that's totally fine. So the question is, you get the emotion, you know what it is, and either it's not clearly tied to a memory, or when you start to feel where you might have come from, there's a flood of stuff coming through.
So you won't go far wrong just working with what's there, right? My general sense of like, oh my God, why is life so hard? Right? It's been a really tough couple of years, right? The economy, the general political trouble in the blockchain space, the inability of the blockchain space to grow up and solve real problems, all of that stuff is a million different little stressors that result in an emotional relationship with a situation or a predicament or a condition of existence rather than a single individual trauma, right? So there are situations which are inevitable things that you have to deal with, like aging, right? Or, am I old enough that it's managed decline, or can I still get my shit together? Great question. Hard to say, right? 10 years ago, that question was easy. This is not managed decline. You still have the time to get your shit together. Make the time, clear the calendar, put in the energy. Now, how do you know, right? So, there is no individual point trauma associated with aging for most people. There's just a sense of a gradual loss of potential, right? You kind of have this feeling of like, well, to what degree is what I am versus is there a brighter future ahead of me? Now, that is not a single point trauma, right? That is a pervasive adaptation, which is very normative to middle age. In fact, it almost defines middle age. What do you do with that? You sit with the emotions. Okay, here we are. Is this it? Hard to say. Right? So you have a set of strong emotions. If those things are about conditions or predicaments or just aspects of reality that you were exposed to, if you have, let's say, I don't know, a parent who's kind of neurotic, right? There'll be a whole bunch of reactions to low-grade neuroticism that are just neuroticism as a condition of existence, rather than specific point trauma when somebody had an awful meltdown in the middle of your birthday or wherever it happened to be. Does that kind of make sense?
Yep. So what you're saying is it doesn't need to be a point experience. It can be a kind of experience that's repeated over time.
Yeah, and in those experiences, it's not that you've got lots and lots and lots of single atomic points. That's just a condition of experience, right? I mean, if I come from Scotland, it rained a lot and it was cold a lot. So the condition of existence was that my environment was cold and wet. And, it turns out that I really dislike as an adult being cold and wet because my body's natural operating temperature is like 27 or 28 degrees because I have the Indian genes. So growing up in Scotland in the 1970s, I was always freaking freezing because nobody around me had realized that I was genetically different from the local Scots. And as a result, I was going to be much happier with 3 sweaters on rather than 2. So that sort of thinking, these things are just predicaments of existence. They may cause individual trauma, point trauma as well, but they're just conditions of existence. You can have an emotional reaction to a condition of existence. You want a really deep sense of all of this stuff is really there about, like organism response to environment with the intention of changing environment or changing response, right? Like, oh, you know, this repeated pattern makes me feel a particular way, or this condition of existence makes me feel a particular way. You know, the reason you're having those emotions is because something inside of you wants to change the situation so that you no longer have this problem. Like, okay, this is no good. This keeps happening. This is no good. I have a huge backlog of feelings about this. Those feelings all together say, this is no good. Do something different, right? So point trauma, immediate learning about a single event, this more kind of environmental, you know, condition of existence stuff, it's the same thing. Something inside of you wants conditions to change. It's just not, you know, collected around a single point, if that makes sense.
Vinay, could I weigh in on this briefly?
Oh yeah, please. Everybody meet James, who's been doing this stuff with me for a really long time and has seen all of the bad craziness which we do not teach.
So, in a way, there's this kind of two images here that I think might be useful to illustrate. One is that it's very, very important to realize that emotions themselves don't have teeth or sharp edges. The fact that you're having emotions means that you're a functioning human being with a functioning brain and, you know, emotional system. The pain point is our reaction to them. And that's what tends to cause these stickings, is that there's been some kind of deferred maintenance where we have not reacted in a fully natural way to the emotions that are arising naturally. And so the image that I tend to think of is, it's a very classic cartoon trope of somebody walking down a street and they suddenly see looming up behind them this gigantic menacing shadow that looks absolutely horrible, like some big monster, and they're running away from it and it's following them. And then at some point, for whatever reason, they stop and they turn around and it's like something the size of a flea that's just backlit hugely. And in a way, that's kind of what the act of meditation is doing. It's, rather than just running away from the pain point of perfectly natural emotions that, if everything's working properly, should come and go just under normal circumstances, that something's sticking and your reaction to it is causing it to stick. So meditation is the act of turning around rather than running away from the big scary shadow and going, okay, what? And then eventually when you do that, you see that it's a flea that's backlit and it slinks away. Yeah, but I think the important thing to realize is that this is a, how to put it? This is a more of a passive process as the result of a stable meditation practice, as opposed to something, you know, it is not your job to sit on the mat and psychoanalyze yourself. That's exactly the opposite of meditation. Yeah. This is something that, if you are meditating properly, if your mind is in a still place, these sorts of realizations will bubble up and occur to you naturally. And a lot of times it won't even happen on the mat. A lot of times it'll happen once you have a sustained practice. These sorts of realizations, oh, I've hung on to this thing for quite some time, and it's finally clicked as to why I'm hanging on to it, and then suddenly that bubble bursts. That's just as likely to happen to you, you know, walking down the street to pick up your groceries as it is when you're sitting staring at a wall for an hour. All right, here ended the lesson.
Yeah. So I think there's one thing to expand on top of that as well, James, which is that thing where it will happen later. I think that's really important. So one of the things that makes this whole meditation thing such a pain in the ass at times is when the unconscious mind is well stirred up because there's a lot of stuff going on. You will often find yourself in a position where the rest of your life becomes affected. Like, okay, you know, this thing is coming up and I'm dealing with my past around this and it's kind of kicking my ass. And, you know, often like an artist in a creative process, you could find yourself in a position where you've got a bunch of difficulties just with ordinary function because you've got overwhelming material coming up from the past. Some people will hit that, other people won't. But I think it's important to make time for those kind of processes if they're happening. That's very important. Very important. Have we covered most of this? Or are there more questions specifically about the emotional clearing stuff?
Renee, can I ask you something about the emotional clearing?
Sure.
Yeah. Over the many months that I've been doing this, it was this part with the emotional clearing which was a bit problematic. Thankfully, James gave a very clear explanation on how it should go. I think I was analyzing quite a large proportion of the time. I'm experiencing now long periods of it just being blank, so more or less like open awareness. Mm-hmm. Some days, just a few minutes maybe, there is a massive download of images and whatnot, and these kind of clarities. So is it supposed to go that way, or is something wrong going on?
So your unconscious mind will, generally speaking, process material at a pace that suits it. There can be problems where it goes too quickly. There can be problems where it's really unpleasant, goes really slowly. For the most part, the unconscious mind will produce the change at about a pace that you can handle. The most important part about all of this is, you could say, well, if nothing's coming up, why don't I just get rid of the emotional awareness part and do more mantras? So you could imagine, okay, we're going to do half mantras and half open awareness. That'd be great, right? And what happens is that if you deny the unconscious mind the space, eventually the unconscious mind will kind of just stop trying to clean up the past, right? So it'll just be like, well, you're not really making any time for this. I'm just going to sit on top of these problems and, life will kick your ass more. Right. So, every day you're making the space being like, okay, I'm available for healing. I'm available for clearing up the stuff. I'm putting the time in. This is your time. If there's anything here, let's do that thing. Right. So it's very much about building this receptive relationship with the unconscious mind, where the unconscious mind is just like, well, look, you're putting in the resources, you're making the time available, you're listening to what I have to say. So I'm going to put the time and the energy in dreams and in rest states to, just kind of process the material that's there to process and then make it ready for conscious awareness and release. So it's this process of building a partnership relationship with the unconscious mind, so that the unconscious mind will bring the material to you at a pace that you can handle. And that can involve a lot of sitting around waiting where nothing seems to be happening. And if it turns into, this is kind of like open awareness, I'm just being more sensitized to things, that's okay. But you just have to have that demarcation of like, this time belongs to the unconscious mind for its healing. This belongs to the unconscious mind for building the deeper understanding that allows us to get to the bottom of our lives.
Right. Makes sense. I'm just trying to think. I guess I come from that category of people that you were just talking about some time ago, just maybe not had so much traumatic intensity, or had a very nice and cushy childhood in a certain sense, certain specific points, obviously as a teenager, and
Yeah, I mean, as a category, I got to tell you, I have no understanding of you people.
I do understand the difficulty because there's the other sort of people, and like, what are you anyway? Becomes a question, and then I keep going like, something wrong with me? I mean, have I been protected unnaturally or something like that? But I think I get the picture of how it works from what you've been saying previously. Just different life circumstances, and some things have been amplified, I guess, much more. And those specific points that keep coming back over and over again, I guess.
Yeah, that's interesting. I mean, this does make me think that at some point I may have to get, a group of the people that basically had happy childhoods together and just be like, So, how would you approach this period, this kind of tooling? Like, what do you actually need from these things? Because my experience is that I've tended to teach a kind of people that wound up responding to what I was talking about. And for the most part, what I talk about is like life sucks and then you die. Like, this is hard. It is not easy. If you think it's tough for us, imagine how tough it is for these poor bastards in poor countries, right? Never,
Yep.
particularly the ones who aren't getting educations. So, in my world, it's always been very much about like, life is hard and we're not doing enough for the people for whom life is even harder. For the people for whom life really isn't hard, I find it very hard to relate to these people. Like, a really, really like, whoa, I don't know what they're doing. How does that even work? So I think it's just worth noting that we've got a lot of spirituality which is really intended for people for whom life is not very hard. There's a whole kind of Californian ideology of spirituality, which is like, the first thing is life isn't hard. Life is abundant and beautiful, and you should come and experience the abundant beauty of life with us. And you're kind of like, so how does that work? Well, I tell all these people that life is abundant and beautiful, and they give me money, and that money makes my life abundant and beautiful. You see what I'm saying?
Yep.
So yeah, I mean, I think it's quite. Yeah, I'm hearing very strongly that there are definitely people who do not have this kind of issue, and I'm going to have to do some thinking about how do we adapt the meditation stuff for those people, because becoming enlightened is still the challenge for everybody, whether they had nice parents or not. It's still the basic challenge, but it may be that there needs to be a bit of fine tuning for these people. Like, maybe for them, it's a case of like, well, let's have a think about other people's pain for a minute. Maybe this is about dealing with objective reality and the emotions around objective reality. Like, okay, you dealt with your own pain, but now we're going to talk about those homeless people you step over on the way to Starbucks. And I'm not in any hurry to send people down those kind of rabbit holes. I think that, if people are lucky enough to have fairly decent lives, going out and looking for pain to go and experience is not really the way. But it might be worth taking a little bit of a probe at, like, so how do you feel about the world that you're living in, given that the world that you're living in is kind of a shit show right now? Maybe there's some stuff there. But yeah, I mean, this is all sort of ongoing, like, organizational development, right? Like, I am in the process of figuring out how to fine-tune the emotional release teaching, because it clearly is not just like immediately obvious to people. I had a bunch of strange experiences that gave me a particular take on it. So yeah, I definitely, thank you for all the help on fine-tuning this, folks.
Thanks for that. I mean, if I can very briefly weigh in on what you just said, the way I tend to look at it is, of course, I know about this happy-clappy Californian thing, and that's sort of the vibe I try to explore myself initially. You get the feeling that it's somewhere not very believable. It's not very credulous, and of course, I mean, I myself had my problems. I did some therapy myself, but it's I think where somebody like myself comes into doing practices like what you have advised and the kind of worldview that you've talked about is the sense of, it's not really a fairyland out there. There is a dissonance. There is a dissonance between the feelings that I might be having within my environment and what's apparently happening around me. I think of the story of the Buddha before he stepped out. They talk about the story when he went with his charioteer to the world outside, and people die, people age, etc. That type of thing.
The first exposure to suffering, old age, and death, when he's had a perfect life up until that point.
Correct. Yeah. In other ways, of course, when it's about political problems, when it's about poverty, when it's about simple suffering that friends may have, or oh my God, this is a real problem, and that kind of thing.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I mean, the reason I'm cackling here is I had a conversation with an Indian who had spent about a year and a half in Europe and was going back to India. And, her comment on the entire situation was, I just can't believe how miserable these white people are. She'd just come over and was just agonized and appalled by the level of emotional misery that was ambient inside of white culture. And she was just like, no, I've had enough of it. I can't handle this anymore. It was like, the emotional poverty is so terrible. I just can't walk through the streets. And she legged it back to whatever corner of India she was from. So, I think that there are definitely culturally dependent and culturally constructed parts of this. I've often said to people that, like, the Western approach to handling the emotions looks basically about as bad as Indian sanitation in poor cities. Like, we just specialize in keeping different kinds of things clean, right? What can you say? What do we want? We want, Indian technology for maintaining the mind and the emotions, and Western technology for maintaining the sewers.
Yeah, makes sense. Yeah.
And some of this also, I think, is that, in India, historically, we didn't really have much access to science and technology, right? I mean, there was certainly a good mathematical tradition. There was an advanced understanding in areas like astronomy, but we never got to the point where we could, cast titanium and discover aluminium, right? It was a different kind of approach. Which meant that the smart people that wanted to improve quality of life tended to worry less about the questions which became the foundation questions of science, but spent an awful lot of time worrying about human culture and human nature and what could be done to improve humans' experience of being alive. So I think that we just had a lot more smart people worrying about this stuff in the Asian context. China has it too. Than you saw inside of Europe, where most of those questions were answered by the church. And the church's answer was pretty much like, hey, this is kind of not your problem, man. So, anyway. Right, let's crack on, because I'm aware that we are an hour in. What else should we be talking about, folks? Does anybody have any particular experiences they want to discuss? What else is going on here?
Vinay?
Mm-hmm.
Vinay? Can I add to what you guys were talking about earlier?
Yeah, sure. Who are
So,
you?
like,
I don't.
Irshad. My name's Irshad.
Ah, got it. Cool. Good to meet you.
Yeah. Yeah, for the people who say they don't have emotional issues, right? Maybe it's like also a preparation tool, because when you get to a point where you're taking on enough responsibility where there is that amount of stress on you and things are hitting the fan and you're in conflict with a lot of people, this type of practice, if you have it with you and you know how to use it, you get to sort of process all the bullshit before it becomes too difficult and too much baggage, and it starts interfering with your decision-making process. You get what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, I do. That's a very good point.
So it's not something you just kind of put away, even though you don't have a rough childhood. You should keep it and develop it, and it's like a strength. You know what I mean?
Yeah, I think that is true. I'm just not sure that the people who are sitting there without anything to feel bad about are getting much out of it. But I'm reluctant to lighten that process, because the people that it really probably catches the most are the people who think that they're fine, do a bunch of meditation, then old emotions come up and kick them halfway across the room. So for the people that are kind of in denial, I think the necessity of that sitting practice is there very much as a safety catch. So I'm reluctant to be like, well, if you had a really nice childhood and everything is fine, you could do this practice a little differently, because there will be people, and they're the most at risk population, are the people that think their childhoods were fine, and then they do these kind of practices, and then their lives come to pieces at the seams, and that stuff is really bad. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's difficult. It's really difficult. Okay, let us crack on into new territory. Other things that people have experienced. What are the other things that we ought to be talking about here?
Well, I had a question about the degree of experimentation. I tend to err on the side of being quite experimentative, and I want to know to what extent should I restrain myself. And I can give examples if you want.
Well, so the general principle here is this, right? You've done a ton of spiritual stuff in several different traditions. You're in your 40s, you have a very large beard, and by most people's standards, you are a wild-eyed spiritual madman. So at that point, kind of sort of you're under your own recognizance, right? Like, if something goes wrong in your practice, there are probably 5 people that you know that you could talk to about that stuff other than me, all of whom would give you absolutely first-rate spiritual advice, some who you've been working with for a long time. So for you, the pragmatic risk of experimentation is essentially nil. You might get a little more, it might work a little better one way or another way, but if something goes horrifically wrong, in all probability, you'll get it sorted out, and it's very unlikely that a little bit of meditation is going to make anything horrifically wrong happen for you, because anything that can go horrifically wrong, you probably sorted out 5 or 10 years ago. So I think you're in a category where, you could definitely screw around with it some, and it's not going to do you any harm. You can adjust for fit. The one thing I say is, when you have adjusted for fit, check it with me in case there are specific things you missed. Like, hey, wait a minute, that kind of dismantles this part of the process. That's not going to work the way that you want it to work. So it's important to adjust, if you're going to adjust, but then make sure that you review. And that doesn't matter if you're doing it a little bit here and a little bit there.
So my worry is not so much about getting hurt or get, you correctly point out, I'm not that worried about it, but more so kind of worried about getting off the most effective path and not noticing.
So, I mean, for the most part, this is why I say when you've done some experimentation, you try a new thing. If that new thing becomes a thing that is just the way that you do it, then check in after a month or two of doing it that way, and then we can review that modification, and I can point out whether I can see any reason to do it that way or not do it that way.
Got it. All right.
Because at the end of the day, like, much as I try and get people to stay pretty close to standardization, for the most part, that is because most of those folks are going to drop out, right? They're going to do it for a while, then they're going to say sod it, and they're going to do something else. By the time people have done 6 months and they've really figured out, okay, this really works for me, then it becomes time to say, okay, so what other experiences do you have? What other practices have you done? What other technology do you have access to? How does your life work? What other experiences do you have to bring to it? And then you could talk about beginning to fine-tune the practice. And for people that are already advanced practitioners, this is when you start having to ask questions about all this stuff. Like, okay, well, I've done a bunch of meditation. I'm now getting into a position where I'm beginning to wonder, like, is there life after death? Because the only fear left that I can feel is the fear of death. Hey! And at that point, kind of the little antenna going like, oh, completion stage practitioner. Oh. So now we have to talk about life and death stuff. And that's when the whole kind of circus of additional toolkits comes out. Because once you get down to the remaining fear is the fear of death, but you're on the other side of the fear of death, you are damn close to enlightened. In many cases, you will be enlightened. So, that's sort of the thing of like, all of this experience, weightlifting your way through your emotional garbage and watching your mind. Eventually, you begin to hit this bedrock thing of like, wait a minute, I'm going to die. And I sit down and I meditate, and all I feel is the fear of death. Like, oh, right. So there's this guy you may have heard of called Ramana Maharishi. He also was afraid of death, but because he was very smart, he was afraid of death at 16 with no practice. And, that's where you begin to enter into the kind of domain of like, now we unload the spiritual technology because you finally have a clear awareness of the problem, which all spirituality is intended to deal with. Everything up until then is really just preparatory practice and training wheels. It can give you a high, clear, stable, lovely, consistent quality of life. It can make you feel like you're exactly the person that you were meant to be. But eventually, the actual process of dying will begin for you, and then the fear of death will come up, and then that's going to be what you're dealing with. So, the fear of death thing comes to everybody in the end, and the practice doesn't really begin to do its job at the fundamental transformational level until the fear of death is the thing which is being transformed. But for most folks, that is, 5, 10 years, a decade, even more away from where they are when they do this practice. And the rest of the kind of, Vajrayana or Nath Sampradaya or Tantra, or whatever the rest of that toolkit doesn't really kick into gear until the fear of death is the fundamental material that's coming up. Yeah, just giving. Rebecca says, just giving the news, reading the news gives me trauma. Like, yeah. Twitching. You're the second person I've heard refer to getting physical twitches when they're meditating. If that consistently happens, this is possibly a kriya, which is kind of blocked energy clearing out of a pipe. It may also be minor neurological stuff. I would tend to do massage on the areas that had that kind of twitchiness and see whether it goes away over time. But if it persists in a way that interferes with the meditation or is just weird, give me a shout. We'll get on a call. Take a look at it. But yeah, the twitching thing is, yeah, Kriya, possibly Kriya. Visual artifacts. Yes. So visual artifacting is really common. Probably what's happening is you're leaving your eyes too still. So if you're doing the meditation open-eyed and you're just staring at one thing in an unfixing way, then because the eyes are, how do I say this exactly? They're adaptive. So what will happen is they'll tend to generate like an after image. You know, if you look at something like a bright red square, and then you look at a white surface, what you'll see is a kind of green shadow there, because the eye has accommodated to seeing the red square, and then you take the red square away and it kind of overcompensates. So similarly, if you do the meditation with the eyes very fixed in a single position, the visual processing will tend to get a little weird. Like just letting your eyes wander around a little, letting the attention move around the room. Like, okay, I'm sitting here with the open awareness. Typically that will get rid of the visual artifacting, and it doesn't make the meditation any less effective. All right, mind wandering, physiological sensations. Oh wow, okay. Sorry, I'm just catching up. We got some new messages in the chat. I'm just reading down here. General sense of awe during the open awareness. Gustav, do you want to hop on voice for a second?
Here we go.
Hey, how's it going, man?
Oh, it's going great.
Nice to hear from you.
I did this for quite a while years ago, and now I'm just getting back into it. And it's been about 2 weeks, and I'm starting again to get the kind of head rush feeling of you're kind of looking around, and I think it's at a point where you have a total clearness. You're not thinking of anything, and then your eyes kind of bug out at whatever it is you're looking at, and you kind of get this intensity that rises and rises kind of behind your eyes. And I can totally relax out of it. I can recognize it and just kind of, oh, okay, sync out of that. That's actually just a goofy artifact of something. But the tricky thing is it's rather pleasurable, and it's kind of this like, again, I guess we call it a sense of awe or a sense of kind of.
It sounds like it might be the Kundalini awakening.
Is that what it is?
Well, I mean, whatever that even actually means, right? But, welcome to like the weirdness, right? So, I mean, I think it'd be helpful. Like, do you have a rough recollection of how much of this meditation you've done? Because it's a lot, isn't it?
Something like 500 days.
Something like 500 days. Yeah, that's kind of a lot, right? Really, kind of a lot. So, weird stuff starts to happen when you do really a lot of intense meditation, right? So let's actually talk about what's happening, right? You have the open awareness, the attention kind of settles onto something, and then there's this sense of like, imminence, presence, power, importance, wonder, this kind of thing.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, all that's happening is you're noticing the way the world really is. Whoa. Right? William Blake, the poet, like, like to see infinity in a grain of sand and, eternity in an hour and all the rest of this stuff, right? That sort of thing. What's that poem called? Does anybody know offhand? William Blake, the one who talks about eternity in a grain of sand and so on. Something I can't remember the name of it offhand. If somebody could look that up and post it in the chat, that'd be helpful. So that experience, right? What you're beginning to see is mystical reality making its way into your mundane reality, right? Now, mystical reality. What does that mean? Mundane reality. What does that mean? Right? There is. Auguries of innocence. Yeah. So, ordinary workaday reality, your mind is basically optimized for keeping you alive, and most of that is optimized for just being like the people around you, right? You know, if your parents are a particular way and you're 8 years old, you better be more or less aligned with your parents, because otherwise life is going to get real difficult, right? You know, being vegan in a deer hunting household as an 8-year-old is kind of not a viable path forward for the most part. So the ordinary mind forms, but the ordinary mind is shot through holes, right? I mean, does anybody have the experience of when they were a teenager having like all kinds of weird little mystical experiences? Like, you'd sort of have a sense of immortality, or there'd be a sense of like, you'd look up into the night sky and feel like it was alive. You know, kids will casually like, oh, I'm talking to my imaginary friend, and your imaginary friend is like really, really, really consistent and all the rest of this, right? So the consciousness doesn't really form into a kind of coherent, just practical get shit done structure for most people really until puberty, right? Once people hit puberty biologically, in history for most of the time, they would have gone from hitting puberty to having kids to raise in only a few years. So there's a ratcheting down of the consciousness to the pragmatic that hits alongside of puberty that's incredibly powerful for most people. And it really takes quite a bit of effort to get that to not cause, you know, a real closure of the mind. So you do a lot of meditation. What begins to slowly happen is the mind begins to feel competent enough and strong enough, like, okay, I really have this under control. I have this adulting thing down. Things are okay. Whoa. Hang on a second. Let me figure out what the heck that was. My Superman picture decided at that moment to leap from the wall. Yeah, that process by which the mind kind of settles, right? Things are good, things are stable, relatively in control, kind of on top of the situation. Let's just kind of ratchet that open a little and see whether we can cope with it. Okay, so I'm beginning to see more of the world, and I'm in a less pragmatic mindset, and more of the actual nature of reality is visible, and I'm not getting distracted to the point where I'm becoming dysfunctional. Aha, maybe I can have some of this expanded awareness and still meet my fundamental responsibilities. There is a lovely story in, pretty sure it's autobiography of a yogi, about a postman who has taken a bunch of initiations from a guy by the name of Lahiri Mahasaya. And Lahiri is a big deal, right? Lahiri is a mucho big deal yogi who works most of his career as a railway auditor. You know, some little man in an office goes home, mystical yogi, Lord of the Universe. So Lahiri has been teaching this guy a thing called Kriya Yoga. And the fella comes along and is just like, you know, oh, you know, like, I'm in such spiritual bliss, I can hardly deliver my letters. And that sort of thing, like, well, as long as you can deliver the letters, I guess it's not too much spiritual bliss. As long as you're capable of function, if you're seeing the world in this radiant way, as long as it's not interfering with your ability to be in the world, it's working for you. But the important part is that the mind itself is the filter, right? So if it's becoming inconvenient, you can turn it down. And if it's just wide open, like, hey, let's just go for it, you can turn it up. And that notion that the mind is largely self-correcting and manages and adapts to the environment that it's in is very important, right? Things like schizophrenia a lot of those problems seem to be that the kind of reality adjustment machinery is malfunctioning. And if the reality adjustment machinery is malfunctioning, then rather than the mind being able to kind of turn down these other levels of awareness so you can get back to your day job, it just won't turn it down. Like, no, we're not doing that. No, we're out here. Forget it. Screw you. I don't care about the real world. So, malfunctions in the standard equipment do happen, but you're grounded, your life works, you're getting occasional mystical experiences, you've got the ability to turn it up or turn it down kind of on demand. Sounds okay? Tell me a little more.
Yeah, that all sounds about right. It's I'm just starting to get it again, whereas years ago it was quite frequent, walking around the block and just even driving and doing whatever. And you can kind of tell it to go away when you want, but then other times you think, well, maybe I'll just look at this bench for a while.
Yeah.
But I wonder in the practice itself during open awareness, should you let that run rampant as just as a thing to experience, or is it best to say, all right, that's the thing, go away. I just need to.
So, yeah, with the open awareness stuff, if that's sort of what's happening, that's sort of what's happening. Like, okay, my awareness is open, and wow, everything is super sparkly. Oh, the shiny. Oh. And then, but if you have a sense of like, okay, but this is too much, or what about the other way of seeing reality? Aren't both of these things valid? You kind of have to trust yourself to self-correct a little, right? And
right.
This is quite hard. I mean, I remember having quite a lot of conversations with James about this back in the day, about how do you know when it's time not to meditate? Like, okay, like I've just had some mystical experience, a whole bunch of stuff has clicked into place. I kind of want to take a break. And it's actually quite hard to say, okay, well, I've done this for 500 days. I'm going to keep on going. I want to maintain my streak. And it's like, no, you kind of have to get to a point where you're like, okay, I need a little bit of rest now. I don't have the instinctive feeling like, oh, I should be meditating. Like, oh, I should definitely be resting now. And just listening to yourself enough to make those decisions is actually quite hard. So that's an important thing.
Great. Well, that's a very good start to play with.
Yeah. And I mean, a lot of the whole kind of, mystical art stuff, I got a bunch of Tibetan stuff on the wall right now just because I just felt like it. Before that, there was a bunch of Hindu stuff and so on. So that stuff is partly there so that when you go into these expanded states of awareness, you're looking at things which are symbolically meaningful at that level. So it's not that the temples are constructed for no reason. They're there so that when you go into the state of wonder, there's something there to have the wonder about.
Right.
So might be the point where you start thinking about like, hey, maybe I need to, print out some pretty pictures of various gods and stick them in the area where I meditate. Might be the point where you're sort of getting into the space where that stuff is appropriate.
Great. Appreciate it.
Yeah, but I mean, definitely, keep in touch on that. The other thing to watch out for is rebound. So, mystical intensity, I'm seeing the world as it is. Ooh, this is really strong. And then you can often get a flip where it's like, then the next chunk of existential, whatever it is, just comes out with the depths. Like, because you've built up enough confidence and enough strength up here that your mind is like, right, now we're ready to do the next round of clearing of the garbage, guys. Ha-ha. And then you're like, whoa, I've just realized everyone I love is ever going to die. And then suddenly you've got a whole bunch of new shit to deal with. So, just be aware that it's not like, okay, you have solved it. This is a phase. There'll be another bunch of bad shit that'll have to get cleared out at some point. If you're lucky, it will go invisibly in the background and you'll never be aware of it and it will simply dissolve. If you're unlucky, it'll be like you stood on the end of a rake one morning and you're like, boom, fuck. So, yeah, you have to be, don't fly too high. Don't artificially contain yourself to the gutter. Listen to your intuition. Try not to make mistakes. But,
Right.
It's bumbling forward, right? I mean, it's just, there is no, unfortunately, road that we can just march people up. All we can really do is get people equipped to be in the wilderness of their own lives and trust that most of them will make it.
Right. And right now, I'm very unpracticed right now with both the mantra and the emotional part. I'm remembering how fluid I got with it back in the day, and now it's just, I'm a mess. It takes forever even to settle into things. And so another couple months and I'll be back to normal, I think, as far as back to competent, can sit and do it and not just fidget and the posture, the breathing, and all that stuff.
Yeah. The breathing. Oh, absolutely, absolutely. Good. Well, keep it up, man. Keep it up.
Great.
Let's see, Rebecca. Mind wandering and mantra. Yeah, that's what the mind is. Pretty much. Yep, that's what the mantras are for. The mind will wander. The mantra gives the place for you to lead the mind back to. That is 100% how the mantra meditation works. That is, absolutely a sign that you're doing it right. Yes, getting universally distracted by work problems. Yes, if you're in a position where you've got real shit going on in your real life and you sit there on the meditation cushion, all your mind will do is try and solve the real problem. Your mind is being responsible, adult, and grown up, and it might not be exactly what you wanted from meditation practice, but it's clearly urgent enough that your mind is just like, get out of the way, I need the space for real shit. Knock that stuff off. Under those circumstances, if that's what's happening, go with that, right? Don't fight against it, work with it. Visual field wide open. Yes, visual field wide open is fine. Eyes raised slightly, looking a little up. Absolutely fine. Could be looking a little down. Would also be fine. Visual field wide rather than focused is very normal for that state. I want to say there's a guy called Tom Brown who wrote some books about tracking. I've been told by people that read Tom Brown's stuff that he uses the term second attention to mean something very similar to what we mean when we say open awareness. And one of the things they talk about is how wide the visual field gets. So maybe a useful reference. The fear that you may be doing things wrong or the practice doesn't seem to be doing anything. Yeah, there you go. Okay, so that question, I'm just going to read it. Or do you want to hop on voice and actually talk about it? This is a question about fear coming up in wrong turns.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Sure.
So, it's this. So, ever since I began the practice back in 2016, one of the biggest constants that I've had is, okay, this is unsupervised. And I always get this image of, doing these big problems in integral calculus where somewhere down the line a plus turns to minus or some equation just gets turned around and you end in the blind alley and
right.
Oh dear, that kind of thing pops up, and especially because long stretches of the time, especially with the emotional clearing part, as I said, it's mostly blanks. So there's always this thing called going behind, saying there must be something wrong. This is unsupervised. What's happening? Am I deviate? I still sit with it though. So, but it's still there. So, just trying to figure out what's happening.
Excellent. So, you remember that thing you said about nothing is coming up in the emotional clearing?
Right.
Something is coming up in the emotional clearing.
Absolutely. It's the mind is telling me, dude, this was there.
Well, the mind is right. What you're getting is anxiety, right? What if I'm doing it wrong, right? So, let's talk about the pragmatics here. The thing that I keep having to reinforce is that this is about quality of judgment, right? Mm-hmm. So certainly the 6-month review is there so that people can check in and we can make sure that they're doing the practice round about how it ought to get done so they don't blow themselves up, right? So there is a reason for the review. You didn't come in for the review. As a result, you've continued with more uncertainty than is absolutely necessary. Fine, minor issue. On top of that, though, clearly, because it's an emotion that you're familiar with in other areas of your life, it's an emotion, right? Oh, there is a strong emotion here. The emotion is, what if I'm doing it wrong? What if all this effort is wasted, right? And that is a big emotion, right? What if I am on the wrong track and I've made irrevocable decisions that confine me on a track where I'm not going to get anything done? Fuck. I mean, that is a very big fear, and it's not at all far from the fear of death. It's the fear of misspent life, right? So,
you've hit the nail on the head with that one.
Yes, right? Because it's kind of obvious from the outside that that's what you're looking with. So, what's happening is that the actual emotional release period Now you've got the material to work with in that period.
Uh-huh.
Right? Oh, now I'm going to sit here and feel my anxiety that everything is fucked up because I'm in the wrong place, doing the wrong thing for the wrong reason, the wrong time. Ah! Right? And that will be super unpleasant. Right? I mean, like, there's just no way around that. That's a horrible emotion. Ah! And you see what I mean? Like, that's actually a really bad thing to feel. Right?
Yeah.
Right?
Rooms and claustrophobia, lots of things, yeah.
All of that stuff, right? So there is a rich vein of horrible shit to work on in the emotional openness part of the experience, right? And this is why I'm so reluctant to modify that section very much. Like, I want it to be more efficient and I want it to be more effective, but the absolute need for it is really clear, right? Because there you are, it's right there in front of you, and that's the thing that has to get done.
Right.
Yeah. So get a good solid grip on that. That's a really important thing.
Yeah, I mean, when I'm thinking about it, as I've written on Facebook, I'm from India, so I did my schooling in India, did my university in India. The system there, I think, is quite different in the sense that you always kind of guided. There's someone breathing down your neck. You're sort of taken through things. You've followed the rules very clearly compared to maybe what I see with my friends in the West here. So I think it's that habit changing, and sheesh, I am an adult, that kind of thing, I guess, and not being quite sure about it.
And some parts of that will be historic, and some parts of that sound like they're completely current.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Some parts of that are like, okay, this is how it was here now in this new environment, and some parts of that will be decisions that you're making right now.
Indeed.
So that is a big, solid slab of material. And then the meditation practice, as you apply the meditation practice to that material, gradually, that stuff will get worked out and worked on and worked through. And at the end of that, there'll be some lessons like, okay, so what I've learned is I'm going to be much more clear about the information that I'm basing my decisions on, and I'm going to do periodic review to figure out whether those facts are still accurate. Or, some other practice might come out of it where you adjust the way that you live your life in a way that gives that anxiety a result. Like, the anxiety goes away because I took action, which reduces the anxiety. Or I took away the anxiety because I felt for myself, okay, I've done everything that I can with that. The anxiety which remains is irreducible. I'm just going to let that go now.
Right.
And you can go either way on it.
Thank you very much.
Most welcome. Okay, so we've got about an hour and a half. I'm going to do maybe one or two other little urgent bits if there are any, and then let's wrap this sucker up. If you've got anything that has to get done before we wind up, stick it in the chat right now.
I'm going to drop a big hug.
Take care. Good to hear you, man.
Yeah, you too.
Lying down, absolutely fine. I did a lot of my mantra meditation in the beginning lying down. It was just fine. Different from Piti and Sukha. Piti and Sukha, I don't know that terminology. Is that Buddhist stuff? Is that Pali? I don't know. I'm not familiar with the terms. Naturally arise from higher states of concentration. Yeah, that's it. It's just there, right? You see the world as it is. Naturally arising, correct modeling. Symbolic systems, tarot, Kabbalah, I Ching. In terms of this meditation practice, absolutely not under any circumstances. Hell no. One of the reasons that this meditation practice works is there's just nothing to feed the mind on. Right? There's you in a room with you, absolutely minimal distractions. Get hold of your story here because there's nowhere else to go. And the intensity and the directness of that approach as soon as you put some kind of mystical thing in there, as soon as you put some kind of transcendent thing in there, the mind will run screaming from all the emotional bullshit that it doesn't want to deal with. Like, I'm just going to sit here and I'm going to lock on to this special magic mantra. Okay. Oh, it's the magic mantra. Look, I can feel it raising my vibration. And the mind will just run like hell from the direct confrontation with the shittiness of reality. Right? And, that is really, when all is said and done, right, that's where you get Buddhism from. Right? Where'd you get Buddhism from? Suffering, old age, death, there you go. That's what you're working with. So, not that I'm obviously teaching Buddhism, right? I'm teaching Hinduism, but there's a much broader ambient awareness of Buddhist concepts in meditation than there is Hindu concepts. The idea that you've got meditation, it's like, well, look, the situation is God is love, the universe is filled with joy, and all the shitty stuff that's happening where you are is like a malfunctioning fairground ride. More or less the Hindu perspective, certainly the perspective of my guru, which means it's official. Right? But that approach is very hard for people to initially to relate to, right? So the slightly more Buddhist framing around a lot of what I'm discussing is it's a great place to get started because the initial work is very much about suffering and the imperfection of the world. This sucks. Well, yeah, Buddhism gives you a good framework for thinking about this sucks. And then, a bit further in, you're like, oh, I'm having these wild mystical experiences, and I realize there is an enormous cosmic harmony behind all things. Amazing. And at that point, it's like, well, maybe some of these Hindu concepts will be a lot more useful to you now. But it's not that either one of those traditions is literally the complete truth. They're basically two very slightly different schools of thought on very much the same body of experimental practice. What the Hindu meditators see and what the Buddhist meditators see is very substantially the same stuff. They just contextualize a little differently, teach it a little differently, but it's the same. Objective is a strong word to use, but they're two stories about the same relatively nearly objective reality. But in the initial practice, the cutting machinery phase, you want to stay well out of all kinds of mysticism, and you want to stay well out of all kinds of symbolic systems or reaching for anything which is above us and higher than us and better than us or any of the rest of that stuff. Knock all of it flat with the edge of your hand. You sit with you, and you do the basic cleanup. After the basic cleanup is done, mystical states may spontaneously arise, and that's the part where you really need to get me or some other teacher of this stuff involved. Say, okay, look, I've done a bunch of the emotional stuff. I've cleared out a bunch of the basic nonsense and garbage. I'm largely in control of my basic faculties, and I'm no longer lying to myself about the main issues in my life. I'm kind of feeling quite adult and on top of it. And also I'm beginning to get these experiences where I'll sit on the meditation cushion and kind of cosmic things are happening in my head. And that's the point where you kind of need to go find some help. Like, okay, so these cosmic things happening in your head, are they fucking you up? Or are they reinforcing bad habits? Or is it more a kind of gently releasing the illusions into a place that feels more natural? And, debugging that to make sure that you're not getting subtle pathologies as that stuff unfolds, that is a real job, right? Like, that is not an easy thing, because the tendency of the mind to form subtle pathologies as it gets closer and closer and closer to directly addressing the fear of death is wicked strong, right? The mind will really just, it will do anything to avoid unpicking those knots at the center of being. And, what can you do with that, right? I mean, you're just going to have to work with the mind that you have to get to the center of being and unpick those knots. And, the sort of the symbol systems and all the rest of that stuff, like, they're a lot less effective than being locked in a room with the problem and being left with no escape, right? And that is an approach that we're taking here.
Can I take another crack?
Oh, please.
So the way I've always framed this is that, like, fundamentally, both of those paths lead up to the same top. It's just a difference of approach. Like in the symbol-rich tradition approach, the idea is to essentially fill your mind with stuff until it breaks, not in a detrimental way, but in that sense of, this is the purpose of, tarot and Kabbalah, which is all these layers and layers of corresponding imagery that corresponds to various aspects of the universe, and that all, if you look hard enough, it all links into of itself. So a person that immerses themselves in that, like layers and layers and layers of symbolism, will eventually the bottom will fall out of the bucket, and they'll realize, oh my God, everything is one. Oh my God, it's full of stars. That that kind of realization. That is at the top end of those traditions. It's just you're taking the scenic, very, very kind of rugged terrain route to get there. The other approach is exactly the opposite. To still the waters of the pond so you can see to the bottom of it. It's just to kind of gradually empty the mind of things until the fundamentals are left apparent. But again, it's very much a your mileage may vary approach. But fundamentally, what all of these traditions are, whether it's the filling approach or whether it's the emptying approach, it's a willful distraction of yourself until you finally decide to just kind of come off it. And some people need to go through more elaborate acrobatics before they realize that they're ready to just come off it. And others need the more kind of tranquil approach of sitting and looking at things until they realize that they can come off it. But ultimately, any of these things are just distractions from coming off it. And you're only going to come off it when you're ready to. It's just a matter of what practice is most conducive to you getting to the point where you realize you're ready to just come off it.
Yeah. I think that is a pretty good place to stop. Is there any remaining urgent business? Okay, good. So in terms of next steps, a reasonable number of people are doing a reasonable amount of meditation. I guess see everybody in about 2 weeks. That'll be the last of these sessions that will really be largely about individual specific practice questions. And then after that, I think we'll get into a little more of the kind of cosmology and specificity of like, so what does this meditation stuff do in the world that we're now in? What are the philosophies associated with the meditation? Talk a bit about fundamental morality and a few other things along those kind of lines. A little bit of the semantic stuff. That semantic stuff is not strictly necessary for the meditation, but it does help make sense of the things that people perceive in their lives as the meditation process continues. Like, as we continue to do the meditation, we do more of the meditation, you begin to notice the way that people act, you begin to notice the way that you behave, you begin to ask deeper questions about society. So what we'll do as we get towards that stuff is talk a lot more about that and, really get some good focus on like, how are we going to think about these issues? How are these phenomena going to be worked with? How does it all work? Because, if you're just open the awareness by degrees and you don't have an orientation framework to interpret the things that you're now seeing in the world, it's quite difficult to then integrate the experience of meditation into your life. Because if what you see is like, hey, I've just noticed the world is really dark right now and this is hard, and you don't have a framework that gives you some handles on that, it's easy to get overwhelmed. So one more class where we talk about the practicey stuff, and then we will get into these fundamental, the moral philosophy and a few other things along those lines, just so you've got the rest of the toolkit to handle whatever the heck it is that comes out of the awareness practice that you're doing. Okay, that's it, folks. I don't know, do I end this call? Do I just stop it recording? How does this work? I don't even know how to end the call. All right, take care, y'all. See you on Facebook. The other thing is, I will eventually move this thing off Facebook onto something else. But, for now, we'll keep the group on Facebook. Because I am aware that Facebook is evil and, we'll eventually move off it. But for now, here we are. No, there does not seem to be a button for just hanging the whole thing up. Okay, so I will stop streaming.
In the bottom middle.
Stop recording. Yeah, that'll hang me